The sizzling sound of bacon echoed off the barn walls. A cowboy, boots dusty from the early morning roundup, stood beside a cast-iron stove, chewing slowly, staring at his plate like it had just whispered a secret. Across from him, a Japanese woman, barely 22, stood frozen, ladle in hand, unsure if she had made a mistake. "She cooks like my mother," the cowboy finally said, voice low, rough with something no one expected: respect. The men around him, tough ranchers turned part-time guards, paused mid-bite. One chuckled, another shook his head. A third leaned back, tipping his hat with a strange reverence. The woman didn't understand the words, but she understood the silence that followed. She had been taught that Americans were animals, that they'd never eat food touched by her hands. But now, cowboys who once rode to war were asking for seconds, and somewhere behind her ribs, something long frozen, cracked. That was the morning everything changed. The bell rang just after sunrise. Its clang echoed through the dusty ranch yard, not with menace, but with routine. The Japanese women stirred in their bunks, some still stiff from sleep, others already half-dressed, combing their hair with fingers more used to bandages than bristles. The guards hadn't barked orders. They rarely did. Instead, a quiet nod from a cowboy meant it was time for kitchen duty. And so, with sleeves rolled and heads lowered, the women stepped into the heart of the camp, the mess hall kitchen. The space was simple: wood beams, iron pans, a stove patched in rust. But it was clean, American clean, sinks with soap, not just buckets of water. A smell clung to the air, something rich, earthy, unfamiliar. Eggs, they would learn, fried in bacon grease. But for now it was a question no one dared ask. Sachiko moved first. She didn't volunteer, no one had, but her feet led her to the stove without needing permission. Her hands, still calloused from wartime work, began slicing green onions with the ease of ritual. Another woman cracked eggs, fumbling slightly. A third poured water into a pot, watching the steam curl upward like incense. It wasn't cooking. Not yet. It was remembering. Memory in motion. The rations were plain: bread, eggs, a handful of seasoning, some kind of cured meat that smelled foreign but sharp. Sachiko added a dash of miso she'd hidden in a cloth scrap from her sleeve. Just a smear, nothing anyone would notice. Just enough to make it feel like home. She moved fast but gently, flipping eggs so the yolks stayed soft, placing a bowl of steamed rice with quiet reverence beside the sizzling pans. Outside, the cowboys gathered, metal trays in hand, boots scuffing the dirt. Some leaned against the post railings, muttering under their breath. Not in cruelty, but with the unease of men who didn't know what to expect from enemy hands. And then the doors swung open. One by one the cowboys entered. The smell hit first. Bacon, yes, but something else. Something warmer, rounder, that none of them could name. They lined up. The women served in silence, eyes lowered. Trays filled. Toast, rice, eggs, stew. No one spoke, until one did. A cowboy with sandy hair and a crooked smile took his first bite. He didn't chew long. He looked at his plate, then at Sachiko, then back down again. "She cooks like my mother," he said. The room stilled. No one laughed. No one moved. The words landed like a dropped pan. Loud, final, undeniable. One cowboy cleared his throat. Another raised his eyebrows. A third nodded, slow and deliberate, as though trying to decide if he agreed. Sachiko stared forward, lips tight. She hadn't understood the sentence, but she knew. She knew from the hush that followed, from the way the men didn't sneer, didn't push their trays away. One of them took another bite. Then another. A fourth cowboy approached, hesitant. He gestured at the pot she was stirring, then to his tray, then back again. More? He asked. Sachiko blinked. Her hand moved. She ladled another scoop onto his plate. Her eyes didn't meet his. They couldn't. Not yet. Behind her, one of the other women whispered in Japanese, "They're eating it." Her voice trembled. Another murmured, "They're not mocking us." And then, more quietly, "He said it tastes like his mother's." In their world, that sentence was not casual. It was sacred. Mothers were the last memory of peace, the keepers of kitchens before war shattered everything. For a man to say that about enemy food, it wasn't flattery. It was surrender of a different kind. When breakfast ended, the trays were scraped clean. A few cowboys even nodded their thanks. Not formal, just real. The women didn't speak for a long time after, not in the kitchen, not in the barracks, not even when the sun dipped below the hills and the cattle lowed from the fields. But Sachiko lay awake that night, the smell of grease still in her hair, her fingers still stained from soy and salt. She didn't understand the language, but she understood this. Something had shifted, not in the Americans, in her. The smell of soy and smoke still clung to her fingertips as Sachiko lay on the thin cot that night, staring at the beams of the barn ceiling. The blanket rose and fell with her breath, warm against the cold that refused to leave her chest. She should have felt shame. She had served the enemy a meal, and they had praised it. But instead, all she could think about was the sound of a wooden ladle scraping the bottom of her mother's old clay pot. It had been a long time since she'd remembered the kitchen in Osaka. The tile floor cracked near the stove, the tiny window that let in ribbons of afternoon light, and the clatter of bowls as her younger sister spilled rice in her rush to set the table. Her mother's hands moved like music, never hurried, always knowing. Steam from the soup would fog the glass, and Sachiko, as a child, would wipe it with the sleeve of her school uniform just to see the peach tree outside bloom in the spring. New Year's morning had always been her favorite: miso soup with mochi, pickled vegetables set in careful rows, her father's laughter deep in his throat. Now the memory sat heavy in her throat, sweet and unbearable. She had thought those parts of herself were lost, that war had burned them clean. But this morning, standing at a foreign stove, stirring rice she didn't grow, oiling pans she didn't own, her hands had betrayed her. They remembered. They moved like they used to. They measured, pinched, turned, and tasted with instincts born in a home she hadn't seen since the firebombing. But home had not followed her into war. In the military hospital, cooking had become a task stripped of soul. Meals were measured by calories, not comfort. The pots were dented, the floors slick with antiseptic. She had been assigned to food prep during the winter of '44 after a fever took down half her unit. It was considered light duty, but it was no kindness. Every day she ladled broth into bowls for boys missing limbs. Most didn't speak, some didn't eat. She stopped tasting what she made. The miso came powdered, diluted past recognition. The rice was rationed so thinly it broke before it boiled, and every week someone new was gone. Her job wasn't cooking, it was surviving, quietly, obediently, with no salt, no softness, no soul. And now, here, a real stove, real salt, rice that steamed instead of crumbled, vegetables with color, and praise from men who were supposed to hate her. She didn't know what to make of that. Cooking should have felt like betrayal, a violation of everything she was told to believe. The Americans were not human, she'd been taught. They would never let her live, let alone eat, let alone cook. But now they sat at rough wooden tables, chewing slowly, muttering words she could not understand but could feel. And her hands kept moving. They sliced without hesitation, They seasoned without fear. They moved like her mother's, and that terrified her, because her heart, the part she had armored with silence and orders, had not caught up. She had buried her family under duty, wrapped them in the ashes of Nagoya and the bones of loyalty. But her hands had disobeyed. They had opened a door. They had pulled her back into a room with light and sound and the smell of broth that did not mean defeat. It meant memory. And memory, she realized now, was the most dangerous ingredient of all. They had told her this moment would never come, that if it did, it would end in shame, not silence. Her instructors in the military compound had warned them all, again and again, with the crack of wooden sticks and the glare of film strips, that Americans would never accept anything touched by Japanese hands. The enemy, they said, was without honor. If you served them food, they would spit on it. If you bowed, they would laugh. If you survived, it was only because they hadn't yet decided how best to humiliate you. Sachiko had believed it. They all had. How could they not? Every scrap of training had wrapped them in that belief like armor. That surrender was worse than death. That capture was not survival, but disgrace. So when she stood beside the stove that morning, the ladle shaking slightly in her hand, her mind whispered the warning again. This is a trap. They are waiting to shame you. The women in the kitchen moved with the same tension, backs straight, eyes low, silent, except for the hiss of the stove. Even the sound of boiling water made them flinch. One woman, Tamiko, dropped a spoon and nearly cried out in fear. Sachiko bent to pick it up, placing it gently back in her hand. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The fear was shared, like a sickness. Cooking for the enemy felt like offering your throat. They had discussed it the night before in hushed whispers, under the blankets, while the barn settled into sleep. "What if they throw the plates at us?" one woman asked. Another said, "They'll laugh, pretend to eat it and spit it on the floor." Someone else muttered, "They might beat us if they don't like the taste." No one suggested the Americans would be pleased. That idea would have sounded insane, but none of that happened. When the men sat down to eat, there were no sneers, no spitting. There was silence, yes, but not the kind laced with disdain. It was closer to something else. Curiosity, maybe, or confusion. One cowboy chewed slowly, looking down at his plate as if it had spoken. Another muttered something in English to the man beside him, nudging him to taste the stew. And then came the voice, rough, accented, low but clear. "She cooks like my mother." That sentence had changed everything. Now it wasn't just that they ate the food. One of them came back with his tray, smiling politely, pointing to the rice. He said, "More," with a hopeful shrug. Another asked in broken Japanese, "You make?" The women exchanged quick glances. Sachiko nodded once. The cowboy tipped his hat. Later that afternoon, something even stranger happened. As they began prepping vegetables for the evening meal, a cowboy wandered into the kitchen with a sack of potatoes over his shoulder. He set them down on the counter, rolled up his sleeves, and without a word started peeling. The women froze. He wasn't mocking them. He wasn't ordering them. He was helping. Sachiko watched him from the corner of her eye. His hands were clumsy. He peeled too thick, wasted too much. But he kept going. When the silence grew too heavy, he grinned and said something she couldn't understand. But it made Tamiko laugh, soft and sudden. The sound startled even her. They had been told the Americans would humiliate them. Instead, one now peeled potatoes beside them. That evening the kitchen felt different, still quiet, but no longer brittle. The food went out warm. The trays came back empty. One guard nodded his thanks. Another set down a small folded napkin with a drawing of a flower, sketched in pencil. The women did not speak of it directly. Not yet, but Sachiko noticed their movements had changed. A little less stiff, a little more precise. They chopped with care, they stirred with rhythm, as if what they made might be accepted, not because it was forced, but because it was good, and that, more than anything, scared her. Because if the enemy could choose to accept, then maybe, just maybe, they were not enemies after all. The wind outside had picked up that night, whispering through the cracks in the barn walls and kicking up the dust that never quite settled. The women lay on their cots in silence, the scent of stew still faintly clinging to their sleeves. Sachiko walked back from the wash station, her hands raw from scrubbing, her legs heavier than usual. She moved like a shadow, quiet, alert, used to the cold bite of the floor and the stiffness of a thin army-issued blanket. But when she reached her cot, she stopped. Folded neatly on the edge, as if placed with intention, was a second blanket, thicker, softer, woolen, with stitched edges worn down by use, but still whole. She stared at it for a long moment. No note, no name, no order. Just there. She looked around. No one was watching, or if they were, they pretended not to. Tomiko glanced up, eyebrows raised, but said nothing. Sachiko sat slowly, the wooden slats beneath her creaking. Her fingers brushed the fabric. It was warm, heavier than she expected. She wrapped it around her shoulders, letting it swallow her like the comfort she had long forgotten. Her body shivered, not from cold, but from something deeper. From the recognition of care. She had not been given anything since surrender. Not without condition, not without expectation. Every item until now had come with a rule, a warning, a silent threat. But this was different, and that terrified her. The other women whispered in the dim lamplight. Who left it? What do they want? Don't trust it. It's a trick. Their voices braided together in the dark like threads of fear. One woman hissed, They're softening us? They want us to forget who we are. Sachiko didn't answer. She just held the blanket tighter. It smelled faintly of hay and tobacco and something else. Soap, maybe. She could imagine it draped over the arm of a guard, tossed in the back of a truck, forgotten until now. Or maybe it had been brought intentionally. Maybe someone had seen the way she hunched her shoulders against the night and decided she didn't deserve to be cold. But why? Why her? She stared at the wooden beams overhead, watching the shadows shift as the lantern flickered low. The warmth around her body felt like a betrayal. Not to her country, but to her pain, to the version of herself that had endured so much, the one who had scrubbed floors in the dark, boiled water under threat, sewn wounds without blinking. That version didn't need kindness, didn't want it, and yet, here she was, clutching a blanket like a child. In the cot beside her, Tomiko whispered, What if it's real? Sachiko turned slightly. What? She asked. The kindness, Tomiko said. What if it's real? Sachiko didn't know. She had no answer, only questions that pulled her apart in the quiet. The next morning she folded the blanket and placed it beneath her cot, not hidden, but not displayed either, as if tucking it away might help her make sense of what it meant. She wore her old blanket over her shoulders to the kitchen, even though the wind had died down. But something in her posture had changed. Less armor, more weight. That day she chopped vegetables more slowly. When one of the cowboys nodded at her through the kitchen window, she didn't look away as quickly. She didn't smile, but she didn't recoil either, the other women noticed. They didn't say anything, but they watched her, not with judgment, not yet, just uncertainty, like they too were trying to decide what the line was between survival and surrender, and whether warmth was something they were still allowed to feel. The aprons appeared the next morning, folded neatly on the long prep table like offerings left at a shrine. Plain cotton, faded white, some stained from past use, others stiff with newness, no insignia, no numbers, no markings to say prisoner or enemy, just aprons. The women stood at the doorway, uncertain. No order had been given. No explanation shouted. One of the kitchen guards, a tall man with a sunburned neck and a voice softened by the plains, simply gestured toward them. "For the cooks," he said, as if that settled everything. Sachiko stepped forward slowly. Her fingers hovered above the cloth, hesitant to touch. In her world, clothing had always meant rank, control, or shame. Uniforms pressed onto bodies to erase individuality, armbands to mark obedience, rags handed out as reminders of defeat. But this was none of that. This was workwear. She lifted one apron and unfolded it. The fabric was thin but clean, edges frayed in places, the ties long enough to wrap twice around her waist. It smelled faintly of starch and soap. She held it against her chest, unsure what she was meant to feel. Around her, the others murmured, "Why give us this? Are we meant to keep them? Do they expect more work now?" Suspicion moved through the room like a draft. The war had taught them that nothing came without cost. Sachiko slipped the apron over her head. The fabric settled against her shoulders, light but unmistakable. She tied it at her back with careful fingers, pulling the knot tight. And then she froze. Because something inside her had shifted. She did not feel dressed as a prisoner. She felt prepared. The realization hit her harder than any insult ever could. The apron didn't strip her identity, it gave her one, not as a captive, not as a symbol of defeat, but as someone entrusted with a task, someone expected to care for something beyond mere survival. Her hands trembled. For years she had existed only as a function. Carry water, scrub floors, follow orders, endure. There had been no space for pride, no room for ownership. Everything she did belonged to the war, to the Emperor, to the machine. But this was different. She was being asked to cook, not forced, not commanded, asked. A woman beside her, Yumi, whispered, "They want us to take care of the food." Sachiko nodded, unable to speak, because to care was to invest, and to invest was to risk. The guard watched them tie on their aprons and then turned away, uninterested in ceremony. No lecture, no threats. Just the quiet assumption that they would do the work, and do it well. The day moved on. Vegetables were chopped, pots scrubbed, bread sliced, and as Sachiko worked, she felt eyes on her, not hostile, not judging, curious, respectful. One cowboy leaned against the doorframe, sipping coffee, watching her stir a pot. When she glanced up, he nodded once and stepped away. No words, no pressure. The apron grew warm against her body as the kitchen filled with steam. She wiped her hands on it without thinking, just as her mother used to. The gesture startled her. She paused, heart pounding, as if someone had caught her doing something forbidden. But no one did. Instead, another guard brought in a crate of onions and set it beside her without comment. The message was clear. This was her space. This was her work. That night, when she returned to her cot, Sachiko didn't remove the apron right away. She sat on the edge of the bed, fingers tracing the worn fabric, staring at the floor. The blanket lay folded beneath her cot. The apron rested in her lap. Two simple items, both heavier than chains. Because punishment was something she understood. She could endure it, had endured it. But dignity? That was unfamiliar territory, dangerous ground. If she mattered here, if her work mattered, then what did that say about everything she had been told? About the war? About herself? She folded the apron carefully and placed it beside the blanket, and for the first time since her capture, Sachiko felt afraid, not of cruelty, but of what it meant to be seen as human. That evening, the air in the mess hall turned heavy with the scent of grilled onions and salted broth. The sun dipped low, casting long orange bars across the barn-turned dining hall, and the women stood near the back, watching the cowboys stumble in with dust still clinging to their boots. Plates were lined up, food was dished, the rhythm familiar now. A routine they'd come to perform, not with obedience, but with strange, silent grace. One young cowboy, maybe no older than 20, paused at the edge of the serving table. His name, she would later learn, was Jesse. Tall, freckled, and always a bit awkward around the women, he nodded politely and took his tray. But instead of moving on, he pointed to the side bowl of pickled radish, something new they'd added, thinly sliced and arranged like little yellow moons, and asked, "How do you eat these? With them sticks?" He meant the chopsticks, of course. Someone handed him a pair. Jesse held them up like foreign tools, squinting, his fingers fumbling over the slender wood like he was trying to solve a puzzle with no instructions. The women watched, trying to remain quiet, though their shoulders twitched with barely contained amusement. Sachiko, still wearing the apron from earlier, folded her arms and tilted her head. Jessie attempted to grab a piece. The chopsticks crossed, slipped, and sent the radish skidding across the tray. Another try, same result. A third attempt, and this time, in a moment of pure frustration, he stabbed the pickle with the blunt handle of the chopstick and popped it into his mouth with triumph. That did it. A laugh burst from Sachiko. Not a small, courteous chuckle, but a sudden, full, belly-deep laugh that took her by surprise as much as everyone else. Her mouth opened wide, her head tilted back, and for the first time in years she laughed with her whole face, not because she was allowed to, not because it was expected, but because she couldn't hold it in. The room froze for a second. Then it cracked open. The other women joined in, first in gasps, then in ripples, then in waves. Laughter filled the space like music, echoing off rafters and wooden walls, bouncing between cot and cupboard, coat and kettle. No one silenced them. No one barked orders. And most incredibly, Jesse laughed too. He laughed at himself, cheeks red, eyes bright, holding up the defeated chopsticks like a white flag. "Y'all got magic hands," he said, grinning at Sachiko. "I can't make these things do anything." The moment should have felt dangerous. But it didn't. It felt light. There had been so few of those. For months, the women had been shadows of themselves, careful, cautious, silent. Laughter was a luxury they had learned to live without. To laugh was to let go, and letting go in war could mean letting something slip you'd never get back. But now it felt like a rebellion, not against America, not even against Japan, but against despair, against the silence that had defined their days and the weight they carried with every step. The laughter wasn't mockery. It was shared. A cowboy failing at chopsticks, and a woman remembering what it felt like to be more than useful, more than broken. Sachiko wiped a tear from her cheek. Yumi was still giggling beside her, hand covering her mouth, whispering, "He tried to use the wrong end." The women began swapping chopstick stories, mishaps from their own childhoods. One recalled her brother trying to eat mochi with a spoon and flinging it across the room. Another mimed her father catching a fly with his chopsticks and claiming it was an ancient technique. For a few minutes, they weren't POWs. They weren't soldiers or servants. They were sisters again. And for the cowboys, something shifted too. They stopped being guards. They were just men eating dinner. Men who didn't know how to hold two sticks the right way but could hold space for laughter. That night, as the stars blinked to life above the quiet camp, the women didn't whisper about rations or escape plans or fear. They whispered about Jessie's face when the pickle flew. And somewhere in that memory, a little piece of themselves was restored. And then, in the quiet that followed, something else began to stir. Something slower, more fragile. The laughter had cracked open a door, and now memory and meaning began to seep in through the seams. It started with the letters. At first, they were scribbled quietly in the corners of the barracks, written on scraps of paper salvaged from potato crates or the backs of military reports. Some addressed them to family back home. Others wrote to no one, just the future. One woman wrote, "We cook for the enemy, and they say we remind them of home." Another, "They laughed when I showed them how to make daikon broth. Laughed with me, not at me." Sachiko found herself writing too. Not much, just a single sentence at first. "I touched warmth today." She folded the paper neatly, tucked it into a corner of her apron, and said nothing to anyone. But not all the words stayed hidden. Some letters made their way into the outgoing bin, addressed to parents, to brothers, to government offices still functioning back home. Most never made it. A few were intercepted by Japanese intelligence. The phrasing in those intercepted letters troubled more than a few in Tokyo. One report, dry and clinical, warned that the female prisoners had become emotionally disoriented and were displaying signs of inappropriate adaptation. Another simply underlined one line: "They treat us like people." Back at camp, the women began to move differently. The kitchen was still a kitchen, the guard towers still loomed, but something inside them had shifted. That shift deepened when Sachiko found herself beside a cowboy named Frank, who had lost a button on his shirt. He held it up awkwardly, muttering that he didn't have time to find a replacement. Without thinking, Sachiko took the shirt from his hands, threaded a needle from the sewing tin, and began to stitch. Her fingers knew the rhythm: loop, knot, pull. It had been years since she'd sewn for someone. Frank didn't say anything, just watched. After a while, he said, "My ma used to do that when I tore my cuffs wrangling cattle." Sachiko didn't look up. She just nodded. That night, the women sat together in the barracks, quietly folding linens. Someone said, "They let us laugh." Another replied, "They let us care." But it was Yuki, usually the most silent among them, who whispered the line that dropped like a stone in still water. "If this is what they do in captivity, what were we living in before?" No one answered. They didn't have to. Because the question wasn't about America. It wasn't about loyalty or betrayal or the conflict mapped in ink across oceans. It was about the ache in their chests when kindness felt like treason. About the grief that came not from pain, but from being seen. The deepest dissonance was not in serving the enemy. It was in realizing that perhaps they hadn't known peace even before the war began. How could they go back to silence now? Sachiko lay awake that night, the blanket still folded neatly over her legs. The apron hung at the end of the bed. She thought of her mother's kitchen again, of how war had taken everything and how, in the most unlikely place, something small was being returned. Not freedom, not absolution, but something even more complicated: dignity. And dignity demanded a reckoning. Were they still prisoners? Or something else entirely? Are you finding this story as powerful as we do? Please like the video and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The answer came not in words, but in a meal. It began with a simple notice tacked to the mess hall door: "Shared dinner, all welcome." No one explained it beyond that. No orders, no speeches, just the quiet hum of something being arranged. The Japanese women looked at each other cautiously. Some wondered if it was another test. Others thought maybe it was punishment in disguise. But by late afternoon, the kitchen smelled like something new, a blend, a truce. The Americans brought trays of cornbread, mashed potatoes thick with cream, fried onions, and beef stew slow-cooked with carrots. The Japanese women prepared miso soup, steamed rice with umeboshi, and delicate dumplings folded with care. Each side glanced at the other's dishes as they were laid out. The scent of soy mingled with butter. No guards separated them. Just one long table under a wide barn roof, with mismatched plates waiting for food. Sachiko stood behind a tray of dumplings, her hands still slightly damp from kneading. Frank, the same cowboy she had sewn a button for, walked up holding a plate and a lopsided grin. "How do you get 'em to look like that?" he asked, pointing at the dumplings. "Mine always fall apart." She hesitated. Then she reached out and guided his fingers. Pinch, fold, press. Like she had done with her little sister back in Osaka, in a kitchen that no longer existed. Frank's hands were larger, rougher, but he followed her lead. The dough gave way. The shape held. He beamed. Across the table, one of the younger women, Haruko, poured tea into a ceramic cup. She had steeped the leaves herself, using a method her grandmother taught her. She offered it to a tall soldier whose name she didn't know. He took it without flinching, without comment, and drank deeply. She watched, heart thudding, half expecting him to grimace or spit. He didn't. He smiled. She cried. No one raised a flag. No one declared peace. But something happened. It was in the silence between bites, in the clinking of spoons, and the shared passing of salt. The women, once told they would be poisoned or mocked, now watched Americans reach for seconds of miso soup. The men, raised to see the enemy as faceless, now found themselves asking about recipes. At one end of the table, someone started humming. Not an anthem, not even a melody anyone knew, just a low, warm sound that echoed across the room like the memory of a lullaby. Later that night, Sachiko sat with an empty bowl in her lap, the taste of mashed potatoes still lingering on her tongue. She thought of how strange it was that a dish she had once scoffed at now reminded her of comfort, and how her miso, once a weaponized symbol of difference, had become just food, not a threat, not a statement, just nourishment. Cooking had become her language, a way to speak when words failed, to forgive when rules forbade it. She had taught the enemy with her own hands, and in doing so discovered that she could remember herself, not as a soldier's daughter or a prisoner of war, but simply as a woman who knew how to feed another human being. That night, the women didn't whisper. They just breathed, full, confused, grateful. The answer came not in words, but in a meal. It began with a simple notice tacked to the mess hall door. Shared dinner, all welcome. No one explained it beyond that. No orders, no speeches, just the quiet hum of something being arranged. The Japanese women looked at each other cautiously. Some wondered if it was another test. Others thought maybe it was punishment in disguise. But by late afternoon, the kitchen smelled like something new, a blend, a truce. The Americans brought trays of cornbread, mashed potatoes thick with cream, fried onions, and beef stew slow-cooked with carrots. The Japanese women prepared miso soup, steamed rice with umeboshi, and delicate dumplings folded with care. Each side glanced at the other's dishes as they were laid out. The scent of soy mingled with butter. No guards separated them. Just one long table under a wide barn roof, with mismatched plates waiting for food. Sachiko stood behind a tray of dumplings, her hands still slightly damp from kneading. Frank, the same cowboy she had sewn a button for, walked up holding a plate and a lopsided grin. "How do you get 'em to look like that?" he asked, pointing at the dumplings. "Mine always fall apart." She hesitated. Then she reached out and guided his fingers. Pinch, fold, press. Like she had done with her little sister back in Osaka, in a kitchen that no longer existed. Frank's hands were larger, rougher, but he followed her lead. The dough gave way. The shape held. He beamed. Across the table, one of the younger women, Haruko, poured tea into a ceramic cup. She had steeped the leaves herself, using a method her grandmother taught her. She offered it to a tall soldier whose name she didn't know. He took it without flinching, without comment, and drank deeply. She watched, heart thudding, half expecting him to grimace or spit. He didn't. He smiled. She cried. No one raised a flag. No one declared peace. But something happened. It was in the silence between bites, in the clinking of spoons and the shared passing of salt. The women, once told they would be poisoned or mocked, now watched Americans reach for seconds of miso soup. The men, raised to see the enemy as faceless, now found themselves asking about recipes. At one end of the table, someone started humming. Not an anthem, not even a melody anyone knew, just a low, warm sound that echoed across the room like the memory of a lullaby. Later that night, Sachiko sat with an empty bowl in her lap, the taste of mashed potatoes still lingering on her tongue. She thought of how strange it was that a dish she had once scoffed at now reminded her of comfort, and how her miso, once a weaponized symbol of difference, had become just food, not a threat, not a statement, just nourishment. Cooking had become her language, a way to speak when words failed, to forgive when rules forbade it. She had taught the enemy with her own hands, and in doing so discovered that she could remember herself, not as a soldier's daughter or a prisoner of war, but simply as a woman who knew how to feed another human being. That night, the women didn't whisper. They just breathed, full, confused, grateful. But now the meals were over. The mornings were quieter. The kitchen, once alive with the rhythm of clattering pans and cautious conversation, now echoed with absence. Word had spread. Repatriation was happening. The war was officially over, and the Japanese prisoners would be sent home. Or, at least, back to what was left of it. Sachiko sat on the edge of her cot, the folded apron resting beside her like an unanswered question. She had washed it that morning, letting it dry in the slant of sunlight that stretched through the wooden slats of the barn wall. The fabric was soft now, worn in places, a trace of flour still clinging to one hem. Her fingers hovered over it. She didn't pick it up. Around her, the women were packing what little they had. A scarf, a notebook, a piece of dried lavender. Someone was quietly weeping. Someone else was humming under their breath. The same low tune that had floated over the shared meal days before. Sachiko placed her comb inside a small pouch, then her notebook, then a handkerchief with her name, embroidered in one corner, the one her mother had tucked into her sleeve the day she left Osaka. She didn't know if her mother was alive, or her sister, or anyone. She looked at the apron one last time, then stood. She left it on the bed. When the trucks arrived, no one shouted orders. There were no rifles raised, no threats barked, just quiet gestures and nods. A line formed. The women climbed into the back of the vehicle, one by one. Sachiko sat in the middle, her hands resting on her knees, her gaze fixed on the dusty path that led away from the camp. At the dock, the ship waited gray, hulking, indifferent. A cowboy stood by the ramp, his hat tilted low, arms crossed. It was Frank. He didn't wave. He didn't speak, but when she passed him, he gave a small nod. She returned it. It was the kind of farewell you give when words are too simple and silence says enough. On the deck, as the coast receded into mist, Sachiko took out her notebook. Pages were filled with half-thoughts, dreams, fragments of poems she could no longer finish. At the bottom of the last page she wrote one line. He said I cooked like his mother. I think that means I mattered. She stared at it for a long time. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply closed the book and held it to her chest. She didn't understand the war anymore. The lines between right and wrong, victory and defeat, had blurred like watercolors left in the rain. But she knew this. Kindness could bloom in unexpected places. Warmth could slip through cracks in even the hardest walls. And dignity, the kind that had once been stripped from her, could be quietly rebuilt with flour, broth, and laughter. She would never forget the taste of that moment. If this story moved you, please like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And thank you for remembering a piece of history the world nearly forgot.